David Chen gripped the armrest of Seat 14A with white knuckles as United Flight 592 pushed back from a gate at San Francisco International Airport. At 34 years old, this successful software engineer had conquered complex coding challenges, managed million-dollar projects, and built a reputation as one of Silicon Valley's most reliable problem solvers. But none of those achievements could overcome the paralyzing fear that had kept him away from aircraft for 8 long years. The irony wasn't lost on David that he was terrified of the very machines he had once piloted with exceptional skill and precision. Before his life changed forever, he had been Lieutenant David Chen, one of the most talented pilots ever to fly with the Navy's elite Blue Angels aerobatic demonstration team. For 3 years, he had performed aerial maneuvers that pushed both human endurance and aircraft capabilities to their absolute limits, thrilling millions of spectators while representing the pinnacle of American naval aviation excellence. But that career had ended abruptly during what should have been a routine training flight over the Nevada desert. A mechanical failure in his FR-18 Hornet had resulted in a catastrophic engine fire at 15,000 feet, forcing David to eject from his aircraft just seconds before it exploded in a spectacular fireball. He had survived the ejection and parachute landing with only minor injuries, but the psychological trauma of that near-death experience had fundamentally changed his relationship with flight. The official investigation had cleared David of any responsibility for the accident, and his commanding officers had encouraged him to return to active duty after completing standard psychological evaluation and recovery protocols. But David knew something that the investigators and medical professionals couldn't understand. During those terrifying seconds between engine failure and ejection, he had experienced a level of fear that challenged his most basic assumptions about his own courage and capabilities. For someone who had built his identity around precision, control, and mastery of complex systems, the randomness and helplessness of that mechanical failure had been profoundly destabilizing. If a perfectly maintained, regularly inspected military aircraft could suddenly become a death trap despite his years of training and experience, then flight itself was fundamentally unpredictable and dangerous in ways that no amount of skill or preparation could fully control. David had resigned his commission, left the Navy, and rebuilt his life around a career that kept his feet firmly planted on the ground. His transition to software engineering had been successful beyond his expectations. His military discipline, attention to detail, and ability to perform under pressure had served him well in the high-stress environment of technology development. But he had carefully structured his new life to avoid any situation that would require him to fly. Tonight's flight represented the first time in 8 years that circumstances had forced David to confront his aviation phobia. His father was in critical condition at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, having suffered a massive heart attack that morning. The doctors had been blunt about prognosis. If David wanted to see his father alive, he needed to get to Chicago as quickly as possible. Driving would take too long, and there were no alternatives to commercial aviation that could get him there in time. David had purchased his ticket with trembling hands, requested an aisle seat to minimize his view of the ground, and spent the afternoon researching airline safety statistics in a desperate attempt to rationalize his decision. The numbers were overwhelmingly reassuring. Commercial aviation remained statistically safer than driving, walking, or virtually any other form of transportation. But statistics couldn't override the visceral memory of watching his aircraft explode beneath him as he descended under parachute canopy. As Flight 592's engine spooled up for takeoff, David closed his eyes and tried to focus on breathing exercises that his military survival training had taught him years earlier. He reminded himself that this Boeing 737 was maintained by professional mechanics, flown by experienced airline pilots, and equipped with multiple redundant safety systems that made catastrophic failure virtually impossible. The acceleration down the runway triggered memories that David had spent years trying to suppress. The familiar sensation of being pressed back into his seat reminded him of carrier launches and afterburner climbs in his FR-18, experiences that had once filled him with exhilaration but now evoked only anxiety and regret. As the aircraft lifted off and began its climb toward cruising altitude, David fought to maintain the emotional control that had served him well in both military and civilian careers. What David didn't know was that several other passengers aboard Flight 592 had also noticed his obvious discomfort with flying. The flight attendant, a woman named Maria who had been working commercial aviation for over 15 years, recognized the signs of severe flight anxiety and made a mental note to check on him during the flight. More significantly, Captain Rodriguez, the senior pilot commanding the flight, had observed David's military-bearing and disciplined approach to managing his fear, characteristics that suggested possible military aviation background. As the Boeing 737 reached cruising altitude and began its eastward journey across the darkened landscape of Nevada and Utah, David gradually began to relax. The flight was smooth, the aircraft systems were functioning normally, and his rational mind was beginning to override the emotional responses that had dominated his thoughts during takeoff. Perhaps his journey would be routine and uneventful, allowing him to reach Chicago without confronting the deeper fears that had shaped his life for the past 8 years. But at 11:47 p.m., as Flight 592 crossed into Colorado airspace at 37,000 feet, David heard a sound that instantly transported him back to that terrible moment over the Nevada desert when his military career had ended in fire and terror. It was the sound of an aircraft engine experiencing catastrophic mechanical failure, and this time, there will be no ejection seat to save him. The explosion that rocked Flight 592 at 11:47 p.m. was both sudden and devastating. David Chen felt the aircraft shudder violently as the number 2 engine suffered what pilots call an uncontained failure, a catastrophic mechanical breakdown that sent metal fragments tearing through critical flight systems and created an emergency situation that would test every skill the flight crew possessed. For David, the sound and sensation were horrifyingly familiar. The sharp crack of failing metal, the immediate loss of smooth flight characteristics, and the subtle but unmistakable changes in engine noise instantly triggered memories of his own near-death experience 8 years earlier. But this time, he wasn't alone in a single-seat fighter aircraft with an ejection seat as his only escape option. This time, he was trapped in a commercial airliner with 147 other souls who were depending entirely on the skill and experience of pilots he had never met. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom within seconds of the engine failure, demonstrating the kind of calm professionalism that experienced airline pilots developed through years of training and emergency simulations. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've experienced some mechanical difficulties and will be making an unscheduled landing at Denver International Airport. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened while our crew takes care of the situation." But David's military training allowed him to hear what other passengers missed in the captain's carefully controlled announcement. The slight tightness in Rodriguez's voice, the specific phrasing about mechanical difficulties, and the choice to divert to Denver rather than continue to Chicago all suggested a serious emergency that was being managed according to established protocols but carried significant risks. What David couldn't see from his aisle seat was the extent of the damage visible to passengers on the right side of the aircraft. The engine failure had been accompanied by a dramatic explosion that had torn apart significant portions of the engine cowling and sent debris impacts along the wing and fuselage. Fuel was streaming from damaged lines, and several hydraulic systems had been compromised by fragment damage that was affecting the aircraft's controllability. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Williams were working through emergency checklists while dealing with multiple system failures that were making normal flight operations increasingly difficult. The engine fire had been extinguished automatically, but the loss of the engine had created asymmetric thrust conditions that required constant control inputs to maintain straight and level flight. More critically, the hydraulic system damage was making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control, and several critical flight instruments were providing unreliable information. "We're losing hydraulic pressure on 2 systems," First Officer Williams reported, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored the cascade of warning lights and alerts that were illuminating the cockpit displays. "Flight controls are getting mushy, and we've got fuel streaming from the right wing. We need to get on the ground as quickly as possible." Captain Rodriguez was already in communication with Denver Air Traffic Control, requesting priority handling and emergency services standing by for what was likely to be a challenging approach and landing. But as he worked through the emergency procedures, he realized that the aircraft condition was deteriorating more rapidly than normal protocols anticipated. The combination of engine loss, hydraulic failure, and control surface damage was creating a situation that would require exceptional piloting skills to resolve safely. David felt every change in the aircraft's flight characteristics through his seat and the subtle cues that only someone with extensive flying experience would recognize. The slight wallowing motion indicated hydraulic problems. The asymmetric engine noise confirmed power loss on one side, and the occasional control corrections by the pilot suggested increasing difficulty in maintaining normal flight attitudes. For most passengers, these changes were barely perceptible beneath their fear and confusion about the emergency situation. But for David, they told a detailed story about an aircraft that was approaching the limits of controllability and pilots who were fighting to maintain safe flight conditions despite multiple system failures. As Flight 592 began its emergency descent toward Denver International Airport, David realized that his unique combination of fear and expertise was creating an almost unbearable psychological tension. His rational mind understood exactly how serious the situation was becoming, while his emotional responses were being overwhelmed by memories of his own aircraft emergency and the helplessness that had defined his relationship with flight ever since. The aircraft descent was steeper and more rapid than normal commercial operations, another indication that the pilots were prioritizing getting on the ground quickly over passenger comfort. David could feel the increased G-forces and hear the changes in engine noise that accompanied emergency approach procedures, sensations that triggered vivid flashbacks to his military flying days when similar emergencies had been training scenarios rather than life-threatening realities. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez again. The pilot's voice returned to the intercom, this time with more obvious strain despite his professional composure. We're beginning our approach to Denver International Airport. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened, review the safety card in your seat pocket, and listen carefully to instructions from our cabin crew. We're trained for situations like this, and we're going to take good care of everyone. But as David listened to the captain's words and felt the aircraft's increasingly erratic flight behavior, his military training told him something that the other passengers couldn't understand. Flight 592 was in serious trouble, and the pilots were running out of options for maintaining safe flight operations. The combination of engine failure, hydraulic loss, and control surface damage was creating conditions that would challenge even the most experienced airline crews. More troubling was David's growing realization that his own expertise, the very knowledge that was making this emergency so terrifying for him to experience, might be the only additional resource available to help the pilot save everyone aboard. After 8 years of running from his fear of flight, David Chen was about to discover that sometimes the thing we're most afraid of is exactly what we're most needed to face. As Flight 592 continued its emergency approach to Denver International Airport, the situation in the cockpit was deteriorating rapidly. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Williams were dealing with a cascade of system failures that was pushing their Boeing 737 beyond the limits of what normal emergency procedures could handle. The hydraulic system damage was making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control, and the pilots were having to use maximum physical strength to maintain level flight and execute basic maneuvers. "We're losing control authority," First Officer Williams reported, his voice tight with strain as he fought to keep the aircraft's nose level despite the asymmetric thrust and compromised flight controls. "I can barely hold altitude, and the rudder response is getting worse with every passing minute." Captain Rodriguez was simultaneously trying to fly the aircraft and coordinate with air traffic control and company operations, but he was beginning to realize that conventional emergency procedures might not be sufficient to safely land the damaged airliner. The combination of engine loss, hydraulic failure, and control surface damage was creating flight characteristics that were beyond his experience with normal airline emergency training. "Denver approach, United 592. Rodriguez transmitted, his professional composure barely masking the desperation in his voice. "We need to declare an emergency. We've got multiple system failures, losing flight control authority, and we're going to need all available assistance for this approach." The response from Denver Air Traffic Control was immediate and comprehensive. Fire trucks, ambulances, and specialized rescue equipment were already being positioned along the runway, and other aircraft were being diverted to give Flight 592 priority handling and unlimited airspace for whatever approach profile the pilots needed to attempt. But as Captain Rodriguez worked through his mental checklist of available resources and emergency options, he made a decision that was unprecedented in his 23 years of commercial flying experience. The aircraft condition was so compromised that he needed more than just air traffic control assistance and emergency ground services. He needed the input of someone with more advanced flying experience than normal airline operations provided. "Maria," Captain Rodriguez called to the senior flight attendant over the intercom, "I need you to do something unusual. I need you to ask the passengers if there are any military or test pilots aboard this aircraft. We're dealing with flight control problems that are beyond normal airline emergency procedures, and we could use additional expertise in the cockpit." Maria understood immediately that the captain's request indicated a level of emergency severity that went far beyond anything she had experienced in 15 years of commercial aviation. Pilots didn't ask for passenger assistance unless they were facing situations that were beyond their own considerable training and experience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maria announced over the cabin address system, her voice carefully controlled but urgent. "This is an unusual request, but Captain Rodriguez needs to know if there are any current or former military pilots, test pilots, or flight instructors aboard this aircraft. If you have advanced flying experience, please ring your call button immediately." The announcement sent a wave of increased anxiety through the passenger cabin, as people realized that their situation was even more serious than they had understood. Several passengers looked around nervously, but only one call button illuminated in the dim cabin lighting. It was seat 14A. David Chen's hand was trembling as he pressed the call button, 8 years of carefully constructed avoidance and fear battling against his ingrained sense of duty and the knowledge that people's lives might depend on his willingness to confront his deepest fears. When Maria reached his seat, David's military bearing was unmistakable despite his obvious emotional distress. "I'm former Navy, Blue Angels demonstration team," David said quietly, his voice barely steady but carrying the precision of someone accustomed to communicating critical information under pressure. "I have extensive experience with aircraft control problems and emergency procedures, but I haven't flown in 8 years due to personal reasons." Maria recognized immediately that David was battling more than just normal passenger anxiety. His combination of obvious expertise and visible fear suggested psychological trauma related to flying, but his willingness to identify himself despite his distress indicated the kind of character that emergency situations demand. "Sir, Captain Rodriguez would like to speak with you in the cockpit," Maria said gently. "He needs your expertise to help us get everyone safely on the ground." David's walk from seat 14A to the cockpit door felt like the longest journey of his life. Every step took him closer to confronting not just the immediate emergency, but also the psychological barriers that had defined his existence for the past 8 years. The other passengers watched him with expressions ranging from hope to curiosity, unaware that the man walking toward the cockpit was fighting a battle against his own fear that was as challenging as anything the pilots were facing with their damaged aircraft. When David entered the cockpit and saw the array of warning lights, system failure indications, and the obvious strain on Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Williams as they fought to control their aircraft, his military training immediately took precedence over his personal fears. The technical challenges were familiar, even if the specific aircraft systems were different from his military experience. "Captain, I'm David Chen, former Navy lieutenant, Blue Angels pilot from 2012 to 2015. He said, automatically falling into the crisp communication patterns that military aviation demanded. "What's your current situation, and how can I help?" Captain Rodriguez's relief at having additional expertise available was palpable, but he was also clearly curious about why a former Blue Angels pilot was traveling as commercial passenger and exhibiting obvious signs of flight anxiety. "We've lost the number 2 engine. We're down to minimal hydraulic pressure on 2 systems, and the flight controls are becoming increasingly unresponsive," Rodriguez explained rapidly. "I've got maybe 10 minutes before we lose the ability to make controlled inputs, and I'm not sure we can execute a normal approach with the control authority we have left." David's assessment of the situation was immediate and comprehensive, drawing on years of experience with aircraft emergencies that had demanded split-second decisions and unconventional solutions. But as he began to offer technical recommendations, he realized that helping to save Flight 592 would require him to do more than just provide advice from the passenger cabin. It would require him to take an active role in flying an aircraft for the first time since the accident that had ended his military career. "Captain," David said, his voice steady despite the internal battle he was fighting, "I think I can help you get this aircraft on the ground safely. But I'm going to need to take the right seat and actually participate in the approach. Are you willing to let a passenger help fly this airplane?" Captain Rodriguez's decision to allow a passenger to occupy the co-pilot seat and participate in landing a commercial airliner was unprecedented in aviation history, but the deteriorating condition of Flight 592 left him no choice but to accept help from any qualified source. First Officer Williams, despite his years of experience and professional pride, recognized that his strength was failing after 20 minutes of fighting the aircraft's compromised controls, and he willingly stepped aside to allow David Chen to take his position. As David strapped himself into the right seat of the Boeing 737, the familiar sensation of being surrounded by flight instruments and controls triggered a flood of memories both exhilarating and terrifying. The cockpit layout was different from his military experience, but the fundamental principles of flight remained unchanged, and his hands instinctively found the correct positions on the control yoke and throttles. "Systems check," David said, automatically falling into the methodical communication patterns that military aviation had ingrained in him. "I need to understand what we're working with here." Captain Rodriguez quickly briefed David on the extent of their problems. The number 2 engine was completely offline. Hydraulic systems A and B were operating at minimal pressure. Several flight control surfaces were damaged or unresponsive, and fuel was continuing to stream from compromised lines in the right wing. Most critically, the aircraft's flight characteristics had become so unstable that maintaining level flight required constant control inputs that were exhausting the pilot's physical strength. David's assessment was immediate and professional, drawing on his experience with similar emergencies in military aircraft where system failures and combat damage had created comparable challenges. "We need to treat this like a battle damage scenario," he told Rodriguez. "Forget normal approach procedures. We're going to have to fly this aircraft like it's a wounded bird that barely wants to stay in the air." The approach profile that David recommended was unlike anything in commercial aviation training. Instead of the gradual descent and stable approach speeds that airline procedures specified, he suggested a steeper, faster approach that would minimize the time spent in the most vulnerable flight phases while allowing them to maintain enough energy to control the aircraft despite its compromised systems. "We're going to come in high and hot," David explained, his military terminology automatically adapting to civilian context. "Keep the power up to maintain control authority, use a runway length to bleed off excess speed, and be prepared for asymmetric braking because we're not going to have normal wheel brake effectiveness with these hydraulic problems." As Flight 592 began its final approach to Denver International Airport, David felt a familiar sensation of controlled flight that had once been the foundation of his identity and purpose. Despite the 8 years of fear and avoidance, his hands remembered the precise touch required to coax maximum performance from an aircraft operating at the edge of its capabilities. But this return to the cockpit was also forcing David to confront the psychological trauma that had driven him away from flying. Every control input reminded him of his own aircraft accident. Every system warning light triggered memories of the FO-18 fire that had nearly killed him, and every moment of the approach carried the weight of knowing that mechanical failure could still turn routine operations into life-threatening emergencies. "I've got the controls," David announced, taking over from Captain Rodriguez as they passed through 1,000 feet above ground level. "You handle the radios and monitor the systems. I need to feel how this aircraft wants to behave." What happened next was a demonstration of pilot skill that would later be studied in aviation schools and emergency response training programs. David's hands found precise control inputs needed to compensate for the aircraft's damaged systems. His eyes tracked the subtle changes in attitude and airspeed that indicated how the compromised Boeing 737 was responding to control commands, and his military-trained reflexes made the instantaneous adjustments required to maintain safe flight parameters. The aircraft touched down on Denver's runway 16R with a firmness that reflected the challenging conditions but without the violent impact that many passengers had feared. David immediately deployed the speed brakes and began applying asymmetric reverse thrust to compensate for the differential braking effectiveness, techniques that he had learned during carrier landing training but were rarely used in commercial aviation. "Outstanding job," Captain Rodriguez said as Flight 592 rolled to a stop on the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles and rescue equipment that had been standing by for what everyone had feared might be a catastrophic crash. "I've been flying for over 20 years, and I've never seen aircraft handling like that under these conditions." But even as passengers began the evacuation process and emergency responders confirmed that everyone aboard had survived without serious injury, David was dealing with the emotional aftermath of his return to active flying. The successful landing had proven that his skills remained intact despite 8 years of avoidance, but it had also forced him to confront the reality that his fear of flying had been preventing him from using abilities that could save lives. First Officer Williams, who had observed David's performance from the jump seat behind the pilots, approached him as they prepared to leave the aircraft. "I don't know what happened to drive you away from flying," he said quietly, "but what you did tonight was extraordinary. You've got skill that shouldn't be wasted on the ground." David's response reflected the internal conflict that had defined his life since leaving the Navy. "I know I can still fly," he said, his voice carrying both pride and sadness. "But I also know that aircraft can fail without warning, and that even the best pilots sometimes can't overcome the randomness of mechanical problems. I'm not sure I'm ready to accept that risk on a regular basis." As David walked through the terminal toward a hotel where he would spend the night before continuing his journey to see his hospitalized father, he realized that his experience aboard Flight 592 had fundamentally changed his relationship with both his fears and his abilities. He had proven that his skills remained sharp and that he could still perform under pressure, but he had also confirmed that flying would always carry the psychological weight of his own near-death experience. The question he now faced was whether he was ready to rebuild his life around accepting that risk rather than avoiding it. 3 days after the emergency landing of Flight 592, David Chen sat in his father's hospital room in Chicago, watching the man who had taught him the values of duty, service, and facing one's fears despite the costs. His father was recovering well from a heart attack, but their conversations had been dominated by David's account of the emergency landing and the psychological breakthrough he had experienced in returning to the cockpit after 8 years of avoidance. "Son," his father said with quiet wisdom that had guided David through childhood and his early military career, "you spent 8 years running from the thing that nearly killed you, but also from the thing that defines who you are at your core. What happened on that airplane wasn't just about helping other people. It was about rediscovering the part of yourself that you thought was lost forever." David's phone had been ringing constantly since news of the emergency landing had reached aviation media and military networks. The story of the former Blue Angels pilot who had overcome his fear of flying to help save a commercial airliner had captured public attention, but more significantly, it had attracted the notice of aviation professionals who understood the rarity of his combination of skills and experience. Captain Rodriguez had called personally to thank David and to share the results of the aircraft accident investigation. The extent of the damage to Flight 592 had been even more severe than the pilots had realized during the emergency, and accident investigators had concluded that the successful landing had been possible only because of David's unconventional approach techniques and his ability to adapt military emergency procedures to civilian aircraft operations. "Without your input, I'm not sure we would have been able to get that aircraft on the ground in one piece," Rodriguez had said. "You saved 148 lives that night, including your own. I hope you understand the significance of what you accomplished." But the call that had surprised David most had come from Admiral Sarah Mitchell, his former commanding officer from the Blue Angels, who had tracked him down through Navy personnel records and wanted to discuss opportunities for returning to aviation in various capacities. "David, I know what happened to you in Nevada, and I understand why you needed to step away from flying," Admiral Mitchell had said. "But your performance on Flight 592 suggests that your skills haven't diminished, and your experience with overcoming flight trauma could be valuable for other pilots dealing with similar challenges." The Admiral had outlined several potential paths for David to return to aviation without the psychological pressure of regular military duty. Test pilot programs needed experienced aviators who could evaluate aircraft safety systems and emergency procedures. Flight training organizations required instructors who could teach advanced emergency response techniques. Aircraft manufacturers needed consultants who could assess pilot interfaces and control system designs from the perspective of someone who had experienced both military and civilian emergencies. Most intriguingly, the Navy was developing new programs to help military pilots deal with flight-related trauma and return to active duty after psychological injuries that had previously been considered career-ending. David's successful confrontation of his own fears made him an ideal candidate to develop and lead these rehabilitation programs. "You could help other pilots work through the same challenges you faced," Admiral Mitchell had explained. "Your experience with both the trauma and the recovery could prevent other good aviators from losing their careers to psychological injuries that can be overcome with proper support and treatment." As David considered these opportunities, he realized that his emergency experience aboard Flight 592 had transformed his understanding of both his fears and his capabilities. The mechanical failure that had terrorized him for 8 years was still a real risk that could occur again, but his ability to handle such emergencies had been proven under the most challenging conditions possible. More importantly, he had rediscovered the satisfaction and sense of purpose that came from using his skills to protect others and solve complex problems under pressure. The 8 years he had spent in software engineering had been professionally successful, but they had never provided the deep fulfillment that came from aviation and the unique challenges that flying presented. David's decision was influenced by a conversation with his hospital roommate, a retired commercial pilot named Frank, who had observed David's obvious expertise during their discussions about Flight 592. "Young man," Frank had said with a blunt honesty that came with age and experience, "you can spend the rest of your life being afraid of something that might happen, or you can spend it doing something meaningful with skills that most people never develop. I've been flying for 40 years, and I've seen plenty of mechanical failures in emergency situations. The pilots who handle them best are the ones who understand that risk is part of the job, not something to be avoided at all costs." 2 weeks after returning to San Francisco, David submitted his resignation from his software engineering position and began the process of renewing his flight certifications and medical clearances. The transition wouldn't be immediate or easy. He would need to complete refresher training, undergo psychological evaluation, and rebuild his confidence through gradually increasing levels of flight responsibility. But for the first time in 8 years, David Chen was moving toward his fears rather than away from them, and he was doing so with the knowledge that his skills could make a difference in situations where lives hung in the balance. Admiral Mitchell's program accepted his application, and within 6 months, David was back in a Navy uniform, working as both a test pilot and a counselor for other military aviators dealing with flight-related trauma. His office wall displayed 2 items that represented the journey from fear to renewed purpose: his Blue Angels wings from his original service, and a photograph of Flight 592 on the ground at Denver International Airport, surrounded by the emergency vehicles that had stood ready but ultimately unnecessary thanks to the successful emergency landing. 18 months after Flight 592's emergency landing at Denver International Airport, Lieutenant Commander David Chen stood on the flight deck of the USS Carl Vinson, preparing to launch in an F-divided by a -18E Super Hornet for his first carrier qualification flight since returning to active Navy duty. The morning sun reflected off the Pacific Ocean as steam rose from the aircraft carrier's catapult systems, and the familiar sounds of flight operations filled the air with the energy and precision that had once defined his identity. David's journey back to the cockpit hadn't been simple or straightforward. The Navy's trauma recovery program that he now helped to lead had required him to confront not just his own psychological barriers, but also the institutional assumptions about what constituted career-ending injuries versus challenges that could be overcome with proper support and treatment. His work with other pilots dealing with flight-related trauma had been both personally therapeutic and professionally fulfilling. David had discovered that his combination of technical expertise, personal experience with aviation accidents, and hard-won understanding of psychological recovery made him uniquely qualified to help other aviators navigate the complex process of returning to flight duty after traumatic experiences. The pilot he had worked with most recently was Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, a former FO-18 pilot who had experienced a similar engine failure and ejection sequence over the Mediterranean Sea during a NATO training exercise. Her psychological response to the accident had been remarkably similar to David's own experience. Paralyzing fear of mechanical failure combined with deep frustration at being unable to use skills that had required years to develop. Commander Chen helped me understand that fear of flying after a serious accident isn't cowardice or weakness, Lieutenant Martinez had said during a program evaluation interview. It's a normal human response to trauma that can be addressed through systematic exposure, psychological counseling, and gradual rebuilding of confidence. Without his guidance, I would have ended my career rather than working through the recovery process. David's success with trauma recovery programs had led to broader responsibilities within Navy aviation, including advanced flight testing, emergency procedure development, and consultation on aircraft safety system design. His experience with both military and civilian aircraft emergencies had provided him with perspectives that were valuable for improving overall aviation safety across multiple platforms and operational environments. But the assignment that had brought him full circle to carrier operations was his selection as a test pilot for new emergency response systems designed to help pilots deal with catastrophic system failures. The Navy was developing advanced flight control computers that could assist pilots in maintaining aircraft control even when primary systems were severely damaged or compromised. Today's flight would test these systems under control conditions that simulated the kind of multiple system failures that had nearly killed David 8 years earlier and had challenged Flight 592's crew during their emergency landing. The irony wasn't lost on him that his career had come full circle to the point where he was voluntarily subjecting himself to the same kinds of emergencies that had once terrified him. As David strapped into the cockpit of the Super Hornet and began his pre-flight checks, he reflected on the transformation that had occurred since that night over Denver when he had been forced to choose between his fears and his responsibilities to others. The aircraft he was about to fly was far more advanced than the FOA-18 he had ejected from years earlier, but the fundamental risks of mechanical failure remained unchanged. What had changed was David's understanding of how to balance those risks against the satisfaction and purpose that came from using his skills in service of something larger than his own comfort and security. Flight would always carry dangers that no amount of training or preparation could completely eliminate, but avoiding those dangers meant also avoiding the opportunities to make meaningful contributions to aviation safety and military readiness. Cat 1, Super Hornet 201, ready for launch. David transmitted to the catapult control officer, using precise communication protocols that had governed carrier operations since he had first learned to fly from aircraft carrier decks. The catapult launch felt exactly as he remembered. The sudden acceleration from 0 to 150 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds, the sensation of being pressed back into his ejection seat, and the immediate transition from the solid deck of the aircraft carrier to the unlimited freedom of flight above the open ocean. But this launch carried additional significance beyond just returning to carrier operations. It represented David's complete psychological recovery from a trauma that had derailed his military career, his successful transition from victim of an aircraft accident to leader in trauma recovery programs, and his transformation from someone who avoided risk to someone who managed risk in service of important goals. As David climbed to altitude and began the test flight sequence that would evaluate new emergency response systems, he was also contributing to aviation safety improvements that would benefit military and civilian pilots for years to come. His unique combination of experience with both aircraft accidents and trauma recovery was helping to develop systems and procedures that could prevent other aviators from experiencing the psychological injuries that had once seemed insurmountable. The test flight proceeded flawlessly, with a new emergency response system performing exactly as designed when David deliberately induced multiple system failures that simulated the kinds of catastrophic mechanical problems that had once ended his career. But instead of fear or helplessness, he experienced professional satisfaction and confidence in his ability to handle whatever challenges the aircraft might present. As David returned to the USS Carl Vinson and executed a perfect carrier landing, he realized that his journey from trauma to recovery had provided him with something more valuable than just the restoration of his flying career. It had given him the ability to help others overcome similar challenges, and it had demonstrated that the things we're most afraid of are sometimes the things we're most needed to face. When he climbed out of the cockpit and was greeted by the flight deck crew who had supported his return to carrier operations, David carried with him the knowledge that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite fear when others need you to step forward. That evening, as he wrote his flight test report in his stateroom aboard the aircraft carrier, David received a message from Captain Rodriguez, now retired from commercial aviation but still following David's return to military flying. The message was brief but meaningful. Congratulations on your return to carrier operations. Flight 592 passengers weren't the only lives you saved that night. You saved your own life too, and you've helped a lot of other pilots save theirs. Well done. This story reminds us that our greatest strengths often emerge from our deepest struggles, and that the experiences we're most tempted to run from are sometimes the ones that prepare us to help others in their darkest moments. David's journey from trauma to recovery to leadership demonstrates that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about choosing to act despite our fears when duty and compassion call us to serve something greater than ourselves. Sometimes the thing we're most afraid of is exactly what the world needs us to face, and sometimes our scars become the source of our ability to heal others. What did you think of David's story? Rate it from 1 to 10, and let us know where you're listening from. Thank you for watching and sharing this moment with us.